Hi everyone, spooky season is officially upon us and today I am here with some classics book recommendations perfect for this time of year. While I will be talking about some of the most famous spooky classics, I'll also be asking you throughout this video to question how we perceive spooky books and bring in some more haunting themes that I think that you will enjoy and that I think are worth talking about. So let's start with one of, if not the most famous book on this list. We have Dracula by Bram Stoker. Dracula is a book that you know about, or a story that you know about, even if you haven't read it. And I think that that's the great thing about it, is that when you actually start reading it, you figure out what you actually know about the book and what you've picked up through hearsay, through the myths around the book itself. Dracula was published in 1897 and the word Dracula is one that is synonymous with vampires and the vampire genre. One of the things that I love most about Dracula is Bram Stoker's use of letters and diary entries alongside the traditional narrative in order to tell the story. It adds to this sense of place and time and grounds us in the moment that the book is told, but also feeds so well into the genre. This is a genre defining book, and one of the things that I think is worth talking about is the parallels between vampirism and sexuality and the ways in which both mirror each other, how vampirism can be used as a metaphor, an allegory for sexuality at this time. In many ways, Dracula is a book that tries to be subversive. It tries to echo many of the modern developments of the 1890s, and yet these also things are questioned in the books, or there are limitations put in place as to how subversive the characters and the story can be. If you haven't read Dracula, it is a must read. But going back to the idea of sexuality, I'd like to introduce you to another book that you might have read, but if you haven't, then please do, because I actually think that it is better than Dracula. It's one of my favourites, and this is Carmela by J. Sheridan Le Fanu. Definitely an influence on Bram Stoker when he wrote Dracula. This is perhaps the original vampire book in this form. Vampires had been discussed in fiction prior to this, but Carmela was the book that saw the foundations already in place and decided to build on that. And then Bram Stoker goes along and writes a much more famous book, but Carmela I think is the better of the two. Carmela was published in 1872, but rather than having the male vampire Dracula, we have our eponymous vampire Carmela. She's a mysterious girl who comes into the life of our narrator Laura and her father after a carriage crash near their castle home. Carmela and Laura have this incredibly close relationship which in many ways feels romantic or sexual in nature, and in the narration Laura talks about Carmela as the most beautiful creature she had ever seen, and then there's a long paragraph about her features, her large dark and lustrous eyes, her hair being wonderful, and the way that Laura had often placed her hands under it and laughed with wonder at its weight. It was exquisitely fine and soft, and in colour a rich very dark brown with something of gold. I loved to let it down, tumbling with its own weight, as in her room she lay back in her chair talking in her sweet low voice, and she used to fold and braid it and spread it out and play with it. Laura becomes obsessed with Carmela, and we soon learn that this attraction that Laura has towards Carmela, this connection that they have, isn't quite as healthy, and that as we learn more about the mysteries of Carmela, we learn that there might be a very dark and supernatural reason why these two women have been drawn together. Even just talking about this book makes me want to reread it. I love it, and it is a book that is so perfect if you are new to classics or don't know where to start. This is not just good for this time of year, but it is a perpetual favourite of mine. Next up, we have a book that is an all-time favourite of mine. I love it with my whole heart, and it's one of the reasons that I'm here talking to you today. It is a book that's had so much influence on my life. It is Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. It's a multi-generational novel that starts in 1801 and is set in the windswept Yorkshire moors. The landscape is desolate and harsh, and we are made to believe that the people within the book are too. Our narrator is a man called Mr. Lockwood, who is a visitor to Wuthering Heights. There he meets the homeowner Heathcliff, a tyrannical brooding man who rules over the rest of the household, including a young girl called Cathy and a young man called Hareton. As Mr. Lockwood discovers the secrets of Wuthering Heights, including its past and Heathcliff's past, we learn about how Heathcliff came to Wuthering Heights as an orphan, his relationship with Cathy, the daughter of the household, and her brother Hindley, and we trace their tumultuous, wild lives. I love Cathy's line, "I wish I were a girl again, half hardy and wild and free." And at its heart, Wuthering Heights is a book about love and about revenge. Wuthering Heights is a story that I keep returning to, that I can't let go, that I keep asking it to let me back in, because it's a book that will always stay with me and mean so much to me. Next we have The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, another book that I think people know about, but if you haven't read it you might not know just how brilliant it is, how funny it is, but also how well crafted this book is. Our main character is Dorian Gray. He gets his portrait painted, and while this picture sits in his attic, he falls into a life of depravity, of drug taking, of immorality, and while he remains unchanged, it's the portrait in the attic which is rapidly becoming something that is very unlike the beautiful portrait that was originally created. The book is similar in theme to another spooky favourite classic, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. It takes this idea that whilst you may be unchanged on the surface, while people may not perceive you as any different, there is another manifestation of your soul that changes, that ages, that shows who you are inside, that reflects some part of your soul that is usually unseen. I'd like to see a resurgence in people talking about it, especially with films like The Substance that has just come out. I think there is such a place and a need to keep discussing these stories, because I think that they can teach us so much about ourselves now, but also about our history and where we've come from, and why books like this were so important at the time that they were published. Just as we talked about sexuality in relation to Dracula and Carmela, The Picture of Dorian Gray can also be used as an allegory for sexuality. But because of the life of Oscar Wilde, who was quite literally imprisoned because of his sexuality, the themes in The Picture of Dorian Gray are a lot more urgent and a lot more obvious. This is a book that is both dark and funny, that reaches into the lowest depths of Victorian society, but also invites you into a decadent world built on aesthetics. It is brilliant. Then I would like to recommend to you The Murders in the Rue Morgue and Other Tales by Edgar Allan Poe, an author I very much associate with this time of year. I'm not going to talk about all of the short stories in this collection, but I do have a favourite that I would like to talk to you about. My favourite of Edgar Allan Poe's short stories is The Telltale Heart. It's only a few pages long, but it's one that has stayed with me since I first read it. And I think it's very representative of the sort of thing that Edgar Allan Poe is best known for. So The Telltale Heart is a murder story. You are in the mind of a murderer. Our narrator is about to commit a murder and does commit said murder during the course of story. He takes offence to a man whose eye he does not like, whose eye haunts him, and he decides that he's going to murder him because of this. And it says a lot about the mind of our narrator as he hears the beating of the man's heart. He listens out for it as he is waiting in the room for his opportunity. And after he has committed the murder and he has hidden the heart under the floorboards of the room, he can still hear it beating. I think a lot of Edgar Allan Poe's stories are in the telling. They are in the way that they make you feel as you're reading them. They make your skin crawl. They make the hairs on your arms stand out. You feel like you are in somebody else's mind and it feels very uncomfortable, but you're also filled with morbid curiosity. I love the places that he can take you in his stories, and indeed in his poems too. So another must read. Another short story I'd like to recommend to you is The Withered Arm by Thomas Hardy. Thomas Hardy is best known for his novels, but he also wrote lots of short stories, and The Withered Arm is a tale about a woman who has had a child out of wedlock and discovers that the father of her child has got married, and a supposed curse that she puts on his new wife, who because of this jealousy, because of her obsession and fascination with her, her arm slowly withers, and when she seeks medical attention, it's suggested to her that this is not a medical issue, but it is entirely due to the fact that she must have an enemy. I'm always very careful and conscious when reading a story like this about how we should perceive it in today's society and what it says about ableism, what it says about physical difference, about limb difference, and how that is perceived. I think those are really important conversations to have. The thing that I'm most interested about in this story is about rural community and rural customs, and how much was given within rural communities at this time to witchcraft. Even if witchcraft was not something that would be punishable, it was something that was both feared and something that was revered within society at this time. It was seen to harken back to old customs. However, Hardy's commentary is so interesting in this story because there are lines from Rhoda Brooke where she is considering how people have perceived her as a witch because she had a child out of wedlock. It teaches us a lot about how women are perceived at this time if they have had a child outside of marriage, and alternatively how women are treated within marriage, but also if they are childless within that marriage. I'm fascinated by these two women and the parallels between their lives, how they are seen by society, and their relationship with each other. This edition is one of the Penguin Little Black Classics, but it's also published as part of Thomas Hardy's other short story collections. More short stories now, but we're jumping forward in time to some modern classics, and this is The Bloody Chamber and Other Stories by Angela Carter. I read this last year and I absolutely loved it. I didn't expect to love it as much as I did, but I thought that it was so good, and such an interesting mix of stories too. We have stories like The Bloody Chamber, which is a play on the Bluebeard story. It's about a woman who marries a man and finds out that he has had lots of other wives who have had very unhappy endings, and as you're reading it you want to shout through the pages like, get out of there and get out of there now. And on the other hand, you have stories like Puss in Boots, which is told from the perspective of a cat whose narration I absolutely loved. There's also a vampire story in here, The Lady of the House of Loved, which I thought was brilliant. This is once again a genre defining collection of stories which takes traditional stories, gothic tropes and themes, and assesses them from a feminist perspective. I think it still feels slightly novel, slightly exciting to read a book that places such a great emphasis on female sexuality and pleasure and doesn't shy away from it or try to deny it. It is front and centre in the novel, and it's the thing that ties all of these stories together. It's worth mentioning too the quality of the writing in this collection, which only adds to just how enjoyable these stories are to read and how page turning they are. They're stories that you can't put down because they have this very fluid style and also are so compelling. One of my favourite fiction genres is sensation novels. Sensation novels are a product of the mid-Victorian period when print began to be much cheaper. There was an active audience of readers who wanted to engage with thrilling texts that were very similar to pieces of police news that they had read, for example, who wanted quick and easy novels to read that were less about literary merit and more about accessibility and excitement, and literally were about creating a sensation. I have two that I would like to share with you that I think really do define what the genre is about, and the first is The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. There's a scene in this very early on in the book in which a woman escapes from an asylum, and I think that really does sum up how a sensation novel should feel. A good sensation novel combines ideas of the gothic with perhaps some detective elements, and there'll also be features like swapped identities or mistaken identities. There will be a villain in some form. There's also often female characters who are outspoken, who subvert expectations of women at this time, who step out of the a sphere that was created for women to, for example, aid in solving a mystery or to speak in traditionally male domains. There'll also be conversation around what we today would call mental health, but back then was seen as insanity, and so psychology plays a big part in a good sensation novel. The Woman in White is all of those things, and although it's a very big book and not my favourite, I think as the first sensation novel, as the best-selling sensation novel, it is a must-read. However, I prefer, and this is one of my favourite Victorian novels that I think everybody should read, and I think it's so underrated. My favourite is Lady Audley's Secret by Mary Elizabeth Braddon, who became known so heavily as a sensation novelist that I think she felt very restricted by it. People expected her to keep producing, to churn out sensation novels because they were so hooked on them. This is fantastic because essentially at the heart of the story, Lady Audley is a huge anti-heroine. She's somebody that you are instantly suspicious of because she started life as a teacher, as a paid worker, but she has, through marriage, elevated her position within society, and yet there is still so much more to her character that we are suspicious of. Because one, you should be suspicious of a social climbing woman. That's something that even today, I think, in the press, people are suspicious of, that they like to pull apart. Nothing really has changed. At the time they were written, whilst hugely popular, sensation novels like The Woman in White and Lady Audley's Secret were not considered to be the golden age of Victorian literature. They were often derided for the fact that they were popular. Again, something that we can really relate to today. Authors like Wilkie Collins and Mary Elizabeth Braddon created their own niche, and the public really responded to it. I just wish that more people would appreciate them today. And finally, we have another two books that have a very strong theme in common. These are Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier and Vera by Elizabeth von Arnim. Now, these books are really good to read alongside each other because they are very similar in theme. Both books are about young women who marry men but are haunted by the memories of those men's first wives. So in Rebecca, our main character remains nameless, but she is haunted by not just the memories of Rebecca, Maxim's first wife, but also her legacy amongst the household, and it becomes almost obsessive. In Vera, which I think is much creepier, like it really is creepy, our main character, Lucy, great name by the way, her marriage to a man called Everard Wemyss is completely ruled by the ghost of Vera, who isn't a literal physical ghost, but is everywhere within her new life, and the very mysterious circumstances around Vera's death almost act as an omen, a way that you can see that this relationship is heading, and at every turn of the page you can see the horrors unfolding. I think both books deserve a place in the spooky book canon because I think that so many of the books that I've talked about have dealt with women's lives and the way that women are perceived and treated within the world. When you look at all the books that I've mentioned, from things like Carmela by J. Sheridan Le Fanu right through to Angela Carter, we are talking about female sexuality. Something like The Withered Arm by Thomas Hardy, we are talking about how women have been treated when they go against society's expectations of them. And in both Rebecca and in Vera, we are talking about marriage as a convention, but also the ways that marriage can act as a tie, in many cases, to abuse or to a less than perfect past, the ways that marriage restricts these women and leaves this feeling of being unable to escape a past that never had anything to do with them in the first place. Even when we look at a book like Wuthering Heights, Catherine Earnshaw chooses to marry Edgar Linton rather than Heathcliff, even though Heathcliff is her true love, the man whose soul is the same as hers, because of the social expectation that it is the more advantageous marriage. The great thing about all of the books that I've talked about in today's video is that they shine a light on society as a whole, things that we can learn about our society today, but very much teach us about how society was back then and how many of the genre conventions and the ways that many of these authors subverted the conventions of their genre really feed into a much bigger picture. It's why I love classics so much, because they don't just talk about our past, but they can teach us so much about our present. Thank you so much for watching this video. I'd love to know your spooky classics recommendations, and have a very good haunting season. Happy reading!